Hi, so welcome to the talk entitled Q Competition and Complementation Mapping in the L2 Morphin Syntactic Arena. So for this talk, we're going to use the unified competition model that McWhinney proposed in 2004, who proposed that there's a relationship between the strength of cues and language acquisition. In particular, we have the idea of reliability, which suggests that there is either an ambiguity or an unambiguity of mapping between a cue and a form. So highly reliable forms are unambiguous, and unreliable forms are those that have ambiguity, as in multiple mappings for one cue. Yeah, multiple forms for one cue. Availability is the presence of a cue in a contrastive form. So typically speaking, this is related to frequency. Now, properties of this are specific to second language acquisition, would say that everything that can transfer will in fact transfer, and that adults can't use availability information in that process. So frequency isn't particularly useful to them. So therefore, adult L2 learners are going to use transfer, in which case anything that's come from the L1 will be in the L2, and reliability, in particular, probably the number of mappings between one cue and however many forms. Now, the morphosyntactic arena is a particular interest. When it comes in terms of research done for morphosyntax in the competition model, it's typically studied in terms of comprehension, interpretation, and production. And it was found that there was no initial transfer of morphosyntax. However, there might in particular, we're going to study clausal complementation. Clausal complementation is when a verb in a main clause takes as its complement something that's either a non-finite or a finite clause. These, what verbs allow in terms of whether they allow one or both, differs cross-linguistically, and some verbs can take both finite and non-finite. So here we are with English, for example. So a verb like want can take a non-finite complement, like John wants Tom to make the cake or make a cake. Whereas in Spanish, it cannot do that. Juan quiere Tom hacer un pastel. With a non-finite complement, it just doesn't work in Spanish. On the flip side, in English, a verb like want cannot take a finite complement. John wants that Tom makes a cake. Sounds really awful. Whereas Juan quiere que Tom haga un pastel. Whereas we have a verb like want, quiere, taking a finite complement. That's perfectly fine in Spanish. However, some verbs can take both. So a verb like believe in English can take both. So Susan believes that Mary is honest, and although a bit degraded from probably frequency, Susan believes Mary to be honest. Whereas in Spanish, you can only use the finite option, Susana cree que María es honesta, and the non-finite one is unavailable. So if we refer back to our property specific to L2, remember that everything that can transfer will transfer, that morphosyntax doesn't really fall under that umbrella. And so we're going to use L2, they're going to use reliability of cues. This may predict that there'll be greater difficulty where L1 transfer conflicts with L2, and there may be greater difficulty where verbs take multiple configurations. So one question that we can ask from this, is one of these two things more difficult to learn than the other? So in the current study, the participants were highly proficient adult L1 Spanish, L2 English learners, and they took part in two experiments. The first looked at transfer conflict, things like where in English you can say John wants Tom to make a cake with a non-finite complement, and this is bad in Spanish. And experiment 2 looks at multiple mapping. So remember we said verbs like believe can take both finite and non-finite. So we're looking at L2 English for those kinds of verbs too. So there are three types of clausal complementation that appear in this experiment, or these two experiments. The first is persuade type. The second is need type, and the third is believe type. And when I say type, I mean that there's a group of verbs that fall under the pattern, like these prototypical verbs in terms of their clausal complementation. Now, all three types can take non-finite complements. Paul persuaded John to be honest, Paul needed John to be honest, or needed for John to be honest, and Paul believed John to be honest. And so if I make a little table here, if you see here under English, non-finite, all three allow non-finite complements. Now, the persuade type verbs, Spanish and English behave the same. whereas English allows non-finite complements. The same is true in Spanish. English does not allow finite complements, and the same is true in Spanish. So we would think that L1 Spanish could transfer to English here. And so here's this represented in our table. So good, bad, non-finite good in both, and finite is bad in both. So to get to the need type verbs, these differ between English and Spanish, whereas in English, Paul needs John to be honest, with non-finite is good. This is bad in Spanish. And the reverse is true for the finite, where Paul needs that John is honest is pretty terrible in English. The equivalent in Spanish with finite is fine. So here, if we do a full transfer as predicted into the connectionism, unified connectionism model, that would be a conflict. So here is that represented in our table. So whereas English goes non-finite good, finite bad, Spanish goes non-finite bad, finite good. So moving on to the believe type, these are the ones that in English can take more than one type of clausal complement. Susan believes Mary to be honest. Susan believes that Mary is honest. Non-finite and finite are both fine, and Spanish only has the finite option. It sounds really terrible with non-finite. Now, in English in particular, their believe type verbs additionally have restrictions on what they allow in their non-finite complements. So I can say something like, Susan believes Mary to be honest, but if I change my verb in the non-finite complement to something like make, an action, suddenly that sounds a lot worse. But if I reintroduce a perfective aspect marker like have, suddenly it's better. So there are restrictions, okay? So with believe type verbs, a copula or another state of type verb works fine in the complement, but an active verb like make or build or run doesn't work unless it has a perfective or a progressive marker on it. So there's no, for the non-finite in particular, we're interested in that whether L1 Spanish, L2 learners can acquire this distinction, right? And when it comes to non-finite complements coming from Spanish, remember it's bad in Spanish, all types of non-finite complements. So it's not like we can transfer these restrictions from Spanish because any version of this is bad in Spanish. In fact, the equivalent of 22, which is 25, is also bad. It doesn't matter if I add in make. So in 26 is equivalent of 23, still bad. 27 is equivalent of 24, still bad. Okay, so there is no transfer of non-finite complements from Spanish to English. So here is the believe row filled in. English can do non-finite and finite. There's a little asterisk to mark off our aspect restrictions under the non-finite complement column. And then Spanish, you get finite but not non-finite. So research question 1 is on facilitative transfer. Research question 2 is on conflicting transfer. These two research questions appear in experiment 1. And then experiment 2 deals with research question 3, which is about multiple mappings. Now, the research question for facilitative transfer is the following. Do highly proficient adult L1 Spanish L2 English learners differ from monolingual English speakers in regard to clausal complement structures that could be transferred completely, such as persuade type? For research question 2, we're looking at conflicting transfer, something like, do highly proficient adult L1 Spanish L2 English learners differ from monolingual English speakers in regard to clausal complement structures where transfer would conflict, such as need type verbs? And finally, for multiple mappings in experiment 2, do high proficient adult L1 Spanish L2 English learners differ in regard to clausal complement structures dependent on verbs that can map various complements? In experiment 1, the methods were the following. The participants were 17 late L1 Spanish L2 English learners, all born in Spanish-speaking countries. Their age of arrival was 17 or later, and none reported speaking a language besides Spanish at home. The control group was 20 monolingual English speakers. There were 2 written English proficiency measures to see what level of English they were. And all L2 learners performed within the native speaker range in both measures. Here are the exact numbers. As you can see, the natives performed slightly better on both measures, but they fell within the same range. For the materials, there were 3 lists of verbs, those that pattern with persuade, those that pattern with need, those that pattern with believe, which appear in experiment 2. And 10 verbs were chosen from each list, balancing for frequency, and 20 lexicalizations were made of the persuade type, such as the correct condition, Darla forced Cody to watch the show, and the violations. There's 10 correct and 10 violation. Darla forced that Cody watch the show. Similar thing was done with the need type verbs. Andrew asked for Teresa to fix the computer, and Andrew asked that Teresa fix the computer. And so participants saw 10 of each in each condition. So 10 persuade non-finite, 10 persuade finite, 10 need non-finite, 10 need finite in a Latin square design, and they each saw 146 items, including critical items, distractors, etc. For the procedure, they complete a background questionnaire followed by a timed acceptability judgment task based on Hannah Ellis's recommendations. They saw a fixation cross followed by a stimulus and a scale in 3,000 milliseconds in which to complete it. They did 7 practice items and then used a 1 to 5 Likert scale. After the judgment test, they then completed the two English proficiency tasks, and as one Spanish proficiency task, they complete a subsection of the DELE. And then there was a debriefing questionnaire to check for awareness, and none of the participations won't be reported here because none of them showed awareness of what they're being tested on. Now here are the results for this first experiment. On the left half of the graph, we see the persuade type verbs. On the right half of the graph, we see the need type verbs. In all of the pairs, the non-finite complement is red and the finite complement is blue. If we look at the native participants, they did exactly what we expect. And here native is native monolingual English speakers, that they rejected both types of verbs with finite complements and accepted them with non-finite complements. Generally speaking, this is the same pattern we see as the near native speakers, except they rated more highly the finite version. So a repeated measures ANOVA was used to check for facilitative transfer, which was the first research question with the between participants variable group and the within participants variable complement. There was an effect for group, an effect for complement, and an interaction, which found that the native speakers had lower overall judgments, which is to say they rejected more the judgments than the near native speakers for the finite conditions. Now, so that was what means here, right? The two blue bars were significantly different on the persuade type side. So if we ask whether the L2 learners performed native-like with facilitative transfer, the answer is no. The groups were different overall, and they differed specifically for the finite complement. And for research question 2, recall that we asked whether there would be native-like judgments with a transfer conflict. Now this is where the need type verbs were the opposite between English and Spanish. And again, a repeated measures ANOVA with group and complement was run. Effect for complement, no effect for group, but there was in fact an interaction. And once again, the native speakers had lower overall ratings. They rejected more the finite ones, which were supposed to be bad. So again, then you see the blue bars for the need type are once again different. And this is the same pattern for persuade type and need type. So if we ask, do we get native-like judgments with transfer conflict? The answer is no. Near natives and natives differed for finite complements once again. So experiment 2 was the one with the believed type verbs. We're looking for multiple mappings. The participants were the same as experiment 1, and the procedure was the same. Similar to the previous, there were 30 lexicalizations of believed type verbs, and within the lexicalizations, there was a version for each that had the control condition, which was the finite. Leo concluded that Olivia baked the cake. And this is what we expect all participants to accept because this is the same between English and Spanish. Then there's the violation condition, which is bad in English and also couldn't be transferred. Leo concluded Olivia to bake the cake. And then there was a correct condition with a non-finite complement, which was the overt aspectual marker. Leo concluded Olivia to have baked the cake. Participants saw 10 lexicalizations in each condition, and they were presented as part of Latin square design, and the total I was 146. So here we see the results for experiment 2. Here we only have one type of verb, so the left half is the native speakers, the right half is the L2 speakers. The blue bars are the finite. So Leo concluded that Olivia baked a cake. The red bar is the non-finite, like Leo concluded Olivia to bake a cake. And the green ones are the perfective. Leo concluded Olivia to have baked a cake. And as you can see, the native speakers vastly preferred the finite, but definitely accept the perfective version in comparison to the non-finite bear, Olivia to bake a cake, the red one. And this, at first glance, appears to be the same thing happening in the near native group. So the repeated measures ANOVA for the multiple mappings for research question 3/experiment 2 once again had between participants variable for group and the within participants variable for complement. And there was an effect for complement, a rather large one, as you can see by the effect size of 0.712. And then there was no effect for group and no interaction. So if we're going to ask for research question 3, can you be native-like with something that has multiple mappings? The answer is heck yeah. There was no difference between the groups, and they did not treat the complement types different. There was no interaction. So here, the only significance is that both groups preferred finite to everything else and preferred perfective compared to the non-finite. So returning back to our table, and we ask ourselves, where are we seeing differences between monolinguals and L2s? And the locus of the difference is hanging out here in the English finite, right? That there was this over-acceptance of the English finite. So what we would say is the locus of difficulty in this acquisitional task was in sensitivity to ungrammaticality, which means they over-accepted the ungrammatical items for experiment 1 compared to the native speakers. Now they converged, the L2 learners converged on native speakers with regard to grammatical items. And in fact, they had the greatest difficulty inquiring forms that conflicted with their L1. So interaction for the conflicting, so this is interaction for research question 2 with the need type verbs, had a very large effect size for an interaction. Although they still had difficulty with forms that could transfer. So for the persuade type verbs, we still had an effect size of 0.134. It's not as large, but it's still there. So this supports a claim from McWhinney that transfer doesn't apply in the morphosyntactic arena because, you know, non-finite complementation has a morphosyntactic component. But this would all need to be evaluated at earlier stages of learning because these are near native learners. Interestingly and importantly, there was no difficulty shown with the believe type verbs. Multiple mappings did not present added difficulty. So learners learned that, the finite that was exactly like their L1 was fine, and that there's some kind of repair based on if you include the auxiliary in the non-finite complement. And they learned that certain verbs disallowed the non-finite. So they learned that bake was bad versus to be. And they also learned that these can, and like I said, and with auxiliaries, these things are totally fine. So if we look back, the first 2 research questions were rejected. Whereas, which is to say that that these near native learners were still somewhat different from monolinguals in our 2 transfer conditions, but they did fine in the multiple mappings arena. So what would make it easier to acquire believe type verb versus persuade type verbs? And that's a big question, because we're constantly asking ourselves questions about how to improve second language learners' ability to acquire things. At this moment, we can't conclude one way or the other, but what we can say is this multiple mappings in itself doesn't present difficulty. Causal complementation may provide support to the limited role of transfer in morphosyntax as predicted under the unified competition model. And again, sensitivity to ungrammaticality remains the locus of difficulty, whereas you can acquire correct mappings despite conflict. So they still learn that you could have non-finite complements with need type verbs, and you can learn despite multiple mappings as we were in believe type verbs. Thank you.